Good afternoon. We begin with breaking news from the White House. The administration today announced the creation of a new leadership council, describing it as a historic initiative designed to guide economic resilience, infrastructure planning, and national security. The council brings together officials from both parties, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and will be...
The announcement came on a crisp Tuesday morning in late March, delivered from the Rose Garden under a sky so perfectly blue it seemed almost staged. President Elizabeth Warren stood at the podium, flanked by diplomats and military leaders from 17 nations. Her expression carrying the weight of history that she knew was being made in this moment. Today, she began, her voice steady and clear. We announced the formation of the Global Peace Council, the most ambitious international cooperation initiative since the founding of the United Nations. This is not a response to a single crisis, but a fundamental reimagining of how the world's nations work together to prevent conflict, address humanitarian catastrophes, and build a future where our children do not inherit the wars of their parents. The cameras clicked furiously, their mechanical symphony providing a backdrop to words that would reshape international relations for generations to come. In capitals around the world, leaders watched the broadcast with varying degrees of hope, skepticism, and calculation. In war-torn regions where peace had seemed like a distant dream, survivors dared to believe that something might finally change. The path to this moment had been long and bloody, paved with the bodies of millions who had died in conflicts that the existing international order had proven incapable of preventing or stopping. The civil war in the Republic of Valdoria, the humanitarian catastrophe in the eastern provinces of the Confederation of Carthage, the border conflicts that had destabilized the entire southern region of the Eurasian continent. Each crisis had exposed the limitations of institutions designed for a different era, the paralysis of security councils where great powers wielded vetoes like weapons, the inadequacy of peacekeeping forces that arrived too late and left too early. President Warren had campaigned on the promise of doing better, of using American leadership not to impose solutions, but to build coalitions capable of addressing challenges that no single nation could solve alone. Her critics had called her naive, had predicted that the realities of geopolitics would quickly crush her idealistic ambitions. Her supporters had hoped she would try, while privately doubting she could succeed. Now, standing in the Rose Garden with the leaders of 17 nations behind her, she was proving both camps wrong. The Global Peace Council will operate on principles fundamentally different from existing international bodies, she continued. There will be no permanent vetoes. Decisions will be made by supermajority vote, with representation weighted to reflect both population and contribution to peacekeeping operations. Member nations will commit binding resources, both financial and military, to a rapid response force capable of deploying within 72 hours of any humanitarian emergency. She paused, letting the significance of her words sink in. This is not about replacing existing institutions. The United Nations, regional organizations, bilateral relationships, all of these will continue to play vital roles. The Global Peace Council is designed to fill the gaps that existing structures have proven unable to address, to provide capabilities that the international community currently lacks, to create mechanisms for action when the normal channels are blocked or inadequate. The questions from reporters came fast and furious. How would this be funded? What countries had committed to join? How would military forces be commanded? What happened when member nations disagreed? Warren answered each with the confidence of someone who had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, whose team had worked through every objection and contingency, who understood that the devil was in the details but also knew that the details had been carefully considered. The ceremony lasted an hour. When it was over, the real work began. Secretary of State Michael Chen had been the architect of the diplomatic effort that brought 17 nations into the founding coalition of the Global Peace Council. A former ambassador to 3 countries and a veteran of countless multilateral negotiations, he understood better than most how difficult it was to get sovereign nations to surrender any portion of their autonomy in service of collective goals. The key insight that had made the Council possible was recognizing that different nations had different reasons for wanting it to succeed. The European powers, haunted by their failure to prevent atrocities in regions where they had historical connections, wanted a mechanism that would allow them to act without waiting for American leadership. The rising powers of Asia saw an opportunity to increase their influence in global governance structures that had been designed without their input. Smaller nations hoped for protection against larger neighbors, who might otherwise bully them with impunity. Chen had spent 2 years traveling the world, meeting privately with leaders and foreign ministers, listening to their concerns, crafting compromises that addressed their specific needs while maintaining the core principles that made the Council worth creating. He had been cursed at, laughed at, thrown out of meetings, and told repeatedly that what he was proposing was impossible. He had kept going anyway. The hardest part wasn't convincing people that the current system was broken, he later recalled in an interview. Everyone knew that. The hard part was convincing them that this particular solution wouldn't make things worse. Every nation has been burned by international commitments that turned out differently than promised. Every leader has constituents who are suspicious of foreign entanglements. The challenge was building trust, one conversation at a time, one compromise at a time, until we had enough momentum that joining became more attractive than staying out. The founding coalition included nations from every continent, representing nearly 3 billion people and more than half of global economic output. It included traditional American allies and nations that had historically been rivals. It included democracies and constitutional monarchies, federal systems and unitary states, nations with professional militaries and nations that had never fought a war. What united them was a shared recognition that the challenges of the 21st century required new tools, new institutions, new ways of working together. Climate change, pandemic disease, mass migration, terrorism, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, none of these respected national borders. None of them could be addressed by any single nation acting alone, and the existing international order, designed in the aftermath of World War II, had proven inadequate to meet them. The Global Peace Council was an experiment, an attempt to create something better. Whether it would succeed remained to be seen. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. 6 weeks after the Rose Garden announcement, civil war erupted in the Republic of Mervana, a small nation in the mountainous region where 3 continents converged. The conflict had been brewing for years, rooted in ethnic tensions that predated modern borders, exacerbated by economic grievances and political manipulation by leaders who found it easier to inflame hatred than address genuine problems. When the violence began, it escalated with terrifying speed. Militias that had been arming in secret suddenly emerged into the open, attacking villages associated with rival ethnic groups. The national government, dominated by one faction, responded with military force that made no distinction between armed combatants and civilian populations. Within 2 weeks, more than 10,000 people were dead and 500,000 had been displaced from their homes. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, but the familiar dynamics quickly reasserted themselves. One permanent member had economic interests aligned with the Mervanan government and blocked any resolution that might authorize intervention. Another permanent member had historical ties to the opposition groups and refused to support anything that might be seen as favoring the government. The debate went in circles while the killing continued. President Warren convened the Global Peace Council. The meeting took place via secure video conference. 17 heads of state or their designated representatives gathering in a virtual space to address a crisis that was unfolding in real time. The Council's rules had been designed for exactly this situation. When existing mechanisms were paralyzed, when action was needed urgently, when the cost of doing nothing was measured in human lives. The situation in Mervana meets every criterion we established for Council intervention, Warren said, opening the discussion. Mass atrocities are being committed against civilian populations. Existing international mechanisms have proven unable to respond. The humanitarian situation is deteriorating rapidly and will only get worse without external action. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Prime Minister Yuki Tanaka of the Pacific Federation, her tone cautious but not hostile. A rapid deployment of the Council's peacekeeping force to establish safe zones for displaced civilians, combined with diplomatic pressure on all parties to accept a ceasefire and begin negotiations. We're not talking about taking sides in the civil war. We're talking about protecting innocent people who are being slaughtered while the world debates. And if the parties refuse to accept our presence, then we enforce our mandate. The force we're proposing to deploy has the capability to establish and defend safe zones against any militia or military unit currently operating in Mervana. The question is whether we have the will to use that capability. The debate lasted 4 hours. Every concern that had been raised during the Council's formation was raised again. Sovereignty, precedent, the risk of escalation, the challenge of defining success, the danger of mission creep, the difficulty of exit strategies. But there was also something different from the usual international discussions. There was a sense of urgency, of responsibility, of recognition that the Council had been created precisely because the old ways weren't working. There was a willingness to take risks that traditional diplomacy had always avoided. When the vote was called, 14 nations supported the intervention. 3 abstained. None opposed. Within 72 hours, the first peacekeeping forces were on the ground in Mervana. General Sarah Okonkwo had spent 35 years in uniform, rising from a young lieutenant in her nation's army to become one of the most respected military leaders of her generation. She had commanded forces in combat and peacekeeping operations on 4 continents, had written influential papers on military doctrine and humanitarian intervention, had trained a generation of officers in the art of using force in service of peace. Now she commanded the Global Peace Council's Rapid Response Force, a multinational formation of 15 Iwo soldiers drawn from 12 nations, equipped with the most advanced technology available, trained to operate in the chaos of humanitarian emergencies. It was, she often reflected, the command she had been preparing for her entire career. The deployment to Mervana was the force's first operational test, and General Okonkwo was determined that it would succeed. "Our mission is civilian protection," she briefed her commanders before the deployment. "We are not here to win the civil war for either side. We are here to create space for civilians to survive, to establish conditions where humanitarian aid can be delivered, and to support diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. Everything we do must be measured against those objectives." The operation began with the establishment of 3 safe zones in areas where displaced populations had concentrated. The zones were chosen for their defensibility and their accessibility to aid convoys, positioned to provide refuge for civilians regardless of their ethnic background. Within each zone, Council forces established perimeters, set up checkpoints to prevent armed groups from entering, and began coordinating with humanitarian organizations to deliver food, water, and medical care. The response from the warring parties was initially hostile. The government accused the Council of violating Mervanan sovereignty and supporting the opposition. The opposition accused the Council of propping up the government and preventing legitimate resistance. Both sides tested the perimeters, probing for weaknesses, trying to determine whether the peacekeepers would actually fight. They would. The first major confrontation came when a government militia attempted to enter the eastern safe zone to root out terrorists they claimed were hiding among the civilians. General Okonkwo's forces turned them back at the perimeter, a tense standoff that lasted 6 hours before the militia withdrew. The message was clear: the safe zones were inviolable, and anyone who tried to breach them would face military consequences. Similar confrontations occurred at other zones over the following weeks. In each case, the Council forces held firm, demonstrating that they had both the capability and the will to enforce their mandate. The word spread among the warring parties. The peacekeepers were different. They weren't going to stand by while atrocities were committed. They weren't going to retreat at the first sign of resistance. Gradually, the dynamics began to shift. Civilians who had been fleeing the violence began moving toward the safe zones, knowing they would find protection there. Armed groups that had been operating with impunity began to moderate their behavior, aware that the Council was watching and willing to act. The humanitarian situation, while still dire, began to stabilize. And in the diplomatic realm, the pressure created by the military intervention began to produce results. Ambassador Helena Vázquez had been negotiating conflicts for 23 years, from the civil wars of Central America to the ethnic cleansings of the Balkans to the seemingly endless violence of the Middle East. She had learned that peace was never simply the absence of war, that sustainable agreements required addressing the underlying grievances that had caused the fighting in the first place, that the hardest part of any negotiation was getting the parties to see their enemies as human beings with legitimate concerns. The Global Peace Council had appointed her a special envoy for Mervana, tasked with transforming the military intervention into a lasting political solution. It was, she knew, the most difficult assignment of her career. The first challenge was simply getting the parties to the table. The Mervanan government refused to negotiate with terrorists and demanded that the Council forces withdraw before any talks could begin. The opposition refused to negotiate with a government that had massacred their people and demanded that the president be tried for war crimes as a precondition for any agreement. Vázquez began with shuttle diplomacy, meeting separately with each side, listening to their grievances, building relationships with key figures who might be willing to take risks for peace. She didn't argue or lecture or threaten. She simply listened, asked questions, tried to understand. Everyone has a story, she told her team. Everyone has reasons for what they've done, however terrible. Our job is not to judge those reasons, but to understand them, because understanding is the first step toward finding common ground. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A moderate general in the Mervanan military, sickened by the atrocities he had witnessed, reached out through back channels to express interest in a negotiated solution. Around the same time, a faction within the opposition concluded that continued fighting would only lead to more suffering without changing the fundamental power dynamics. Vasquez brought these elements together in secret meetings held in a neutral location outside Mervana. The discussions were tense, emotional, sometimes on the verge of collapse. But gradually, painfully, a framework began to emerge. The agreement, when it was finally announced 4 months after the Council intervention began, was comprehensive and unprecedented. It provided for a transitional government including representatives of all major factions. It established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document atrocities and provide a path to justice that didn't require prosecutions that would make peace impossible. It created mechanisms for power sharing, resource allocation, and minority protection that addressed the grievances that had fueled the conflict. And it authorized the continued presence of Council peacekeeping forces during a 5-year transition period, providing security guarantees that allowed former enemies to take risks for peace. This agreement is not perfect. Vasquez acknowledged at the signing ceremony. No agreement ever is, but it provides a framework for the people of Mervana to build a future together, to address the wounds of the past, to create a society where no one has to fear violence because of their ethnicity or their beliefs. That is worth celebrating, even as we acknowledge the hard work that lies ahead. The Mervana intervention became the template for future Council operations, a model that would be adapted and refined as the organization responded to crises around the world. The combination of rapid military deployment, robust protection of civilians, and intensive diplomatic engagement proved remarkably effective, producing results that traditional peacekeeping had failed to achieve. But the Council's ambitions extended far beyond crisis response. The founders had always understood that the ultimate goal was prevention, creating conditions that would reduce the likelihood of conflicts erupting in the first place. This led to the development of the Global Early Warning System, a network of analysts, sensors, and artificial intelligence that monitored potential flashpoints around the world and alerted the Council to emerging crises before they exploded into violence. The system tracked indicators that had proven predictive of conflict: ethnic tensions, economic stress, political instability, weapons flows, inflammatory rhetoric in media and social networks. When the system identified a high-risk situation, the Council deployed what it called prevention teams, small groups of diplomats, development experts, and civil society specialists who worked with local actors to address grievances before they became grievances worth killing over. These teams operated quietly, without the fanfare of military interventions, building relationships and capacities that made violence less likely. The approach was not always successful. Some conflicts erupted despite the best efforts at prevention. Some situations proved too complex, too deeply rooted, too resistant to outside intervention. The Council learned from each failure, refining its methods, developing new tools, building institutional knowledge that made future efforts more effective. But the successes accumulated over time, creating a body of evidence that the Council's approach was working. Studies by independent researchers found that conflict deaths had declined significantly in regions where the Council was active. Humanitarian organizations reported that their work was easier and more effective when they operated alongside Council forces. Even skeptical nations that had initially stayed out of the coalition began to recognize that something meaningful was being accomplished. The Global Peace Council had its critics, of course. Some argued that it represented a new form of imperialism, powerful nations imposing their values on the rest of the world under the guise of humanitarianism. Others claimed that it undermined state sovereignty, setting dangerous precedents that could be abused by future generations. Still others believed that the resources devoted to the Council could be better spent addressing problems at home. These criticisms were taken seriously by the Council's leadership, who established mechanisms for accountability, transparency, and continuous reform. The goal was not to create a perfect institution, but to create one that was capable of learning, adapting, and improving over time. President Warren, who had championed the Council's creation, often spoke about the importance of humility in international affairs. "We don't have all the answers," she said in an address marking the 5th anniversary of the Council's founding. "We will make mistakes. We will sometimes fail to prevent conflicts we should have prevented, or intervene in ways that make things worse instead of better. But the alternative to imperfect action is not perfect action. It's no action at all. It's standing by while people die because we're afraid of making mistakes." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the assembly of world leaders gathered for the anniversary celebration. The Global Peace Council was created because we believed that humanity could do better, that we could learn from our failures and build institutions capable of addressing the challenges of our time. That belief has been tested many times over the past 5 years, and it will be tested many more times in the years to come. But I remain convinced that it is correct. that we can do better, that we must do better, and that together we will. The applause that followed was genuine, reflecting not just diplomatic courtesy, but genuine appreciation for what had been accomplished. The Council was not perfect. It never would be. But it was real, and it was making a difference. And that was more than anyone had thought possible when the idea was first proposed. The work continued. 10 years after its founding, the Global Peace Council had evolved into something its creators could barely have imagined. What had begun as a coalition of 17 nations had grown to include 63, representing more than 5 billion people. The Rapid Response Force had been expanded and professionalized, capable of deploying significant military capabilities to multiple crisis zones simultaneously. The early warning system had prevented dozens of conflicts that would otherwise have claimed thousands of lives, but the most significant changes were in the realm of ideas, in the way that governments and citizens thought about international cooperation and shared responsibility. A generation of young people had grown up with the Council as a fixture of global governance, taking for granted capabilities and commitments that had seemed revolutionary to their parents. For them, the question was not whether the international community should intervene to prevent atrocities, but how to do so more effectively. They pushed for reforms that made the Council more democratic, more accountable, more responsive to the needs of affected populations. The veterans of the Council's early years watched these developments with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride that what they had built was enduring and evolving. Anxiety that the hard-won lessons of the founding era might be forgotten, that new generations might take for granted what had required such effort to create. General Okonkwo, now retired after a distinguished career that had included command of Council forces in half a dozen operations, gave a speech at the 10th anniversary celebration that captured this ambivalence. We built this institution because we believed that human beings were capable of creating something better than the international anarchy that had produced so much suffering throughout history, she said. That belief has been vindicated beyond our wildest hopes. But we also learned that institutions are fragile, that they require constant attention and renewal, that the work of building peace is never finished. She looked out at the young officers who would carry on the work she had begun, seeing in their faces the same idealism and determination she had felt decades earlier. The Global Peace Council is not a machine that will run forever without maintenance. It is a living institution sustained by the commitment of the people who serve it and the nations that support it. Every generation must choose to renew that commitment, to invest the resources and political capital necessary to keep the Council effective. The moment we take it for granted is the moment it begins to fail. Her words were met with respectful applause, but also with the slight impatience of youth confronting the warnings of age. The young officers knew the Council's history, had studied its operations, understood intellectually the challenges that had been overcome. But they had never known a world without the Council, had never experienced the paralysis and failure that had made its creation necessary. Perhaps that was the greatest success of all, General Okonkwo reflected as she left the podium. To create a world where peace was normal enough to be taken for granted, where young people could be impatient with warnings about fragility because they had never seen the alternative. It was a fragile success, always at risk of being undone by complacency or malice or simple bad luck. But it was real, and it was worth protecting. The work continued. Ambassador Helena Vasquez, who had negotiated the Mervana peace agreement and gone on to lead dozens of other diplomatic efforts for the Council, wrote a memoir in her retirement that became required reading for a generation of diplomats. In it, she reflected on what she had learned over a career devoted to the pursuit of peace. The fundamental lesson, she wrote, is that peace is not a destination but a process. It is not something that is achieved once and then preserved forever. It is something that must be built and rebuilt, constantly adapted to changing circumstances, perpetually defended against those who would benefit from conflict. The Global Peace Council was created to institutionalize that process, to provide mechanisms and capabilities that made the pursuit of peace more effective. It has succeeded beyond what any of us dared to hope, but its success has also created new challenges, new responsibilities, new tests of our commitment to the principles that animated its creation. The question for future generations is not whether they will face conflicts and crises. They will. The question is whether they will have the wisdom and courage to respond effectively, to learn from both successes and failures, to continuously improve the tools and institutions we have bequeathed to them. I believe they will. Not because I am naive about human nature or the difficulties of international cooperation, but because I have seen what is possible when people of goodwill work together toward shared goals. I have seen enemies become partners, suspicion become trust, conflict become cooperation. These transformations are not easy or automatic. They require effort, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. But they are possible. That is the legacy of the Global Peace Council. Not a perfect world, but a better one. Not the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's long struggle to live together in peace. It is a legacy worth inheriting, worth preserving, worth building upon. The work continues. May it always continue. The book became a bestseller, translated into 47 languages, read by millions of people around the world who wanted to understand how a small group of committed individuals had helped change the course of history. Its final words became something of a motto for the Council's supporters, a reminder that the pursuit of peace was not a task that could ever be completed, only carried forward by each succeeding generation. The work continues. 25 years after the Rose Garden announcement, the world gathered to mark the anniversary of the Global Peace Council's founding. The celebration was held in the same location where President Warren had made her historic announcement, though the Rose Garden had been expanded to accommodate the thousands of dignitaries, veterans, and citizens who came to honor what had been achieved. President Warren herself was there, 92 years old now, her hair white, her movements slow, but her mind still sharp and her spirit still fierce. She had lived to see her vision realized beyond anything she had dared to hope, had watched as the institution she had championed grew and evolved and became a permanent fixture of global governance. She was introduced as the mother of the Global Peace Council, a title that made her uncomfortable even as she understood why people used it. She had never seen herself as a visionary or a revolutionary, just as someone who had recognized a problem and worked to solve it. The success of the council was the result of thousands of people's efforts, not just hers. But she accepted the honor graciously, knowing that symbols mattered, that the story of the council's founding would be told for generations, that her role in that story would inspire others to attempt seemingly impossible things. 25 years ago, she began, her voice still strong enough to carry across the crowd. We announced the creation of an institution that many said was impossible. They said nations would never surrender sovereignty to a multinational body. They said the great powers would never accept constraints on their freedom of action. They said the differences between nations were too great, the interests too divergent, the history too bloody. She paused, letting the memory of those doubts settle over the assembly. They were wrong, not because they underestimated the difficulties, which were real and significant, but because they underestimated the human capacity for growth, for learning, for choosing cooperation over conflict when cooperation serves our deepest interests. The Global Peace Council has not ended war. It has not solved all the world's problems. It has made mistakes, some of them serious, but it has also saved millions of lives. It has prevented conflicts that would have devastated entire regions. It has created mechanisms for cooperation that have made the world safer and more stable than it has ever been. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people from every nation and background, united in celebration of an achievement that belonged to all of them. That is not my legacy. It is our legacy. The legacy of everyone who believed that we could do better, who worked to make that belief a reality, who refused to accept that the future had to be as violent as the past. The work is not finished. It will never be finished, but it continues, generation after generation, each building on what came before, each carrying forward the hope that animates this institution. She smiled, the expression of someone who had lived a long life and could look back on it with satisfaction. I am grateful beyond words to have been part of this journey, to have seen what human beings are capable of when we work together, to have witnessed the birth of something that will outlast all of us, that will continue to serve the cause of peace long after we are gone. Thank you, all of you, for believing, for working, for never giving up. She stepped back from the podium and the crowd rose to its feet, applause rolling across the Rose Garden like thunder, a sound of gratitude and hope and determination that seemed to reach up to the heavens themselves. The sun was setting over the Capitol, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The flags of 63 nations fluttered in the evening breeze. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of children playing reminded everyone why the work mattered, why it had always mattered, why it would continue to matter for as long as human beings walk the earth. The work continues. It always would. and that was enough.